Hey, sorry, I stepped away from the bathroom for a second. How's it
Yeah,
going?
hey. All right, how are you?
Good. What can I help you with?
That's well, hey, it's funny. I see you on the interwebs and there you are.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Hey, wow. Yeah, I submitted I'll take it through the system. I was trying to get on earlier because I was having an issue and anyway, I'm Ruben. How are you?
Hey, I'm Drew. I'm doing all right.
Good. Hey, I had a question about restarting the a job. I've got like a hinky connection to the board with my old computer. And sometimes if like it vibrates too much or something, the connection gets lost. And just like a little earlier, when the connection got lost, it was just like in the middle of a detail job,
Yeah.
and it just like stops. So like I'm over across the room sanding something, and then I look over and I don't see anything going on. I go back and I see that Makerverse is just blank, and there's just nothing going on.
Mhm.
And I'm curious to know if there's an easy way to like restart it at a later point, so I don't have to go spend like an extra hour. you know is there a way to do that?
Not an easy way.
Not an easy way out.
So yeah, not an easy way. So the what you it make it's so the way that G code works and the way that,
Yeah,
like when it sends it in there, it's basically just like line after line after line of code. So you would
yeah.
have to isolate what line of code it stopped on, and then
Mhm.
you'd need to cut the all that previous stuff out from beforehand. And that's what can
Right.
be difficult because you got to try to figure out exactly where it is in the lines. And did you slice it in or did you create your G code in easel or
Yeah,
um,
I
okay.
did. I created an easel,
So you can
and
get
I know that.
oh
Go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I'm sorry. No, no, you.
Okay, so you can get pretty close to where you want to be in easel. You can use that simulate feature and you can kind of move that slider and find, and
Right.
it'll tell you like the lines of code where it is. And then you can literally open up that G code file and search, like do a control F and search for that line. And
Yeah,
then try to remove, maybe a little bit before where you think it is, and then you can start it again. The
I see.
it's pretty confusing though, and it's hard to do if you're just diving in there and trying to change stuff. The
Mhm.
easiest thing would be to just restart your cut, and if your machine knows where it is, and like when you plug it back in and just like home your machine and then restart it. So like when you home it, it would move back to where it should be for the cut. And then if nothing else changed, it will follow the exact same path. So those paths that it's going, it just won't be cutting or removing anything. It'll just be following along those paths and kind of going through all of that. And then until it gets all the way down until you're stopped, and then it'll start cutting and pick up right there.
Right. Right.
That's the
And that's what I'm doing
but
right now. Yeah.
but like you said, it
Um,
does take like an hour or longer because it's got to run through that initial G code. Um,
exactly.
so
Exactly. Shit, that would be so much. It would be so much easier. So, but there is a way. I can open up the G code file, just like a text editor. Is there like a certain amount of stuff in the beginning that I need to keep, kind of like an HTML header,
right, like
yeah,
a
you got
3D
to keep
printer.
a certain amount.
Uh, Not for what it's doing, it needs to know where it is. So probably yes.
Yeah. So
So
you got to keep
and the reason that
like where the home information, I guess.
so full disclosure,
Yeah,
I know that people have done this, but I haven't done it myself. But I have done it on 3D printers.
I see.
So on a 3D printer, you do have to have that top part on there, but that's normally for like heating commands and things like that. But you do
Mhm.
want to make sure that it knows, like it has the basic homing commands and stuff like that. So where it starts those lines of code. So you would
Oh,
have that starting code in there, and then where it started actually moving around and making the cuts, that's that section that you would take out. So there's a couple beginning commands, and I'm not sure exactly what those are that
I
you would have.
gotcha.
What might be a really good bet is to ask on the owners group, if you're on the owners group in Facebook, to
Okay.
see. how to cut those different lines out, because I can open it up and look, but then I would still be kind of stabbing in the dark.
Yeah.
One thing that you can do to make sure, and this is something that I do sometimes to make sure that my cuts are lined up, is not starting the router itself, just having it to where it's, so your sled's moving, but not the actual, bit, because then it's not
Right.
going to material. So it's going to like move around, and then you make sure that it's lined up where it should be lined up. And it's like going
Yeah.
to where it should be going before it starts and before you kick it off.
Sure. Sure.
So that's something you
Yeah.
can try. So that's one of the things that we've talked about with doing in the next version of Makerverse, is we want to
Mhm.
have that ability to go in and actually create G code and edit G code and kind of and do some of those changes. But it's just really difficult to pick up in the middle of a cut on where you left off without kind of going in there and playing around with the simulation.
I
If you can
got you.
find the line in the simulation of what you need to delete.
Yeah, and I think, well,
Yeah.
I do. So like in Makerverse, you've got the 3D, you've got the 3D view, right? And I usually do that, but then if you turn off the 3D view, it tells you that it's got the G code lines. It tells you the lines of G code. And I've gone through that and have seen like, where I am, where it lines up and all that stuff. But okay, yeah, well, that'd be a great feature to have.
Yeah, I know. It would be really helpful, especially if it's like a really long cut where it's been going for, like an hour and a half or something like that.
Yeah.
And then be able to go in there and try to editing and picking up where it left off. It's just once the commands are sent, then it just moves to the next line. And because you lost it lost the signal, it lost what line it was on.
Exactly.
So that's why it doesn't know exactly where to pick up, because it doesn't know what G code line it was on, because the signal was like, instead of just pausing it, it was just completely like
lost. Yeah.
Because if it was paused, or or even if you hit pause, and it would tell you like what line it paused on, so you'd be able to isolate that exact line. But otherwise you're going to kind of have to figure it out and try to do like a little bit before that. But the easiest thing is to just run your cut again, because just wait for it to get to the point where it picks off. And like I had that happen once, and that's what I did instead of going in and editing the G code. It was a much smaller cut. It was only like maybe about, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes that it went through, but I just restarted it and then started my bit. And I know that some makers will go through and do like one last pass around their whole design anyway, just to kind of clear off any excess like burrs and stuff like that. So it kind of acts like that when it's going through. It just kind of clears off burrs and can kind of clean your cuts up a little bit while it's moving around.
Okay. Well, let's see. Well, yeah, I appreciate that info. I've got another. Is there, because one of the things I've run into, I've got the M2, I've got the Z-axis deal and all that, but one of the things I've run into is the Z-axis. I can't get it set exactly right, and so, and it's probably a combination of like my spoil board, and if things are just off kilter, sometimes it just goes like too deep. Right. So when I'm trying to do like an etching of like a in this case like a coaster, I'm looking at it right now. It on some of them it's fine, but on others it just goes like way too deep, and I know that's because the board must not be flat, right? So is there like a way to do the I've seen other, is there a way to do like a Z-axis like touch points, can you set that up, or is that something I could set up on mine?
With the M2 it has the capability, but not the firmware isn't set for it yet.
I see.
So you can't do like a touch sensor or a probe sensor or something like that yet. And it could be a couple different things causing like the Z-axis to go plunging in. It could be the material. So as you said, like making sure that your wasteboard and your material is flat and it's the same surface all the way around. Because I mean, plywood is just, it's bowed like naturally. So trying to make sure that it's secured down. Like I screw mine down around like where I'm going to cut on know I'm going to be like waste spaces and stuff like that to help get it as flat as possible. You can use clamps too, which can help as well to kind of make sure that it's all connected in there. So that can cause it because it's, as it's bowing out or bowing in, it can kind of like move up and down in your depth. And then the next thing is, have you ever done the Z-axis scaling in Makerverse?
Well, I'm not sure that I have. Is that part? I mean, I've done the calibration, but I mean, is that part of it, or?
It's one of the tabs in the calibration tabs. That's
Huh,
Z-axis. So, and I can show you where it is. If I can connect mine.
sure.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Let me just share my screen again so you see it. Let's show the screen. And so right here, Z-axis. Can you see my screen?
I can. Yeah. I'm just.
Yeah, so it's
Let me
right
share
here.
my screen.
So it's calibrate right here. And then Z-axis.
I see. Uh-huh.
And then in Z-axis, you can calibrate, so you can move it, so you can tell it a distance to move. And then you have, 10 is just kind of the default. So you can say move 10 millimeters, and then you measure the actual distance that it moves. So you measure the distance between, the easiest is kind of from the top mount of the linear rod, and then the actual like Z-axis assembly itself. And then you'll measure that with like a caliper. So it's like this. Let's see. This is a little older M2, but I can show you on it. So my other one's attached to my frame. So it's like this section right here. So when you move it, you'll measure between here and here. And then you say like move down 10 millimeters, and then you measure this again, and then subtract the difference and see what if it actually moved 10 millimeters.
I got you.
And that can help with this as well. And you can do in the calibration guide that we have on our resources page, it's got some pictures of what to measure from and kind of go through that step, and it'll kind of walk you through step by step of what you need to do for that as well.
I see. Is there
What's up, John? You want something to add?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna maybe, hey Drew, I was just gonna maybe end up helping for him to be able to end up understanding. So even though the piece of equipment seems like it's sophisticated and that it should end up knowing more than we know, stepper motors and all of those type of things need to be taught what their measurements are. They can keep track of measurement really well, but without them being taught this is an inch or this is a millimeter and this is a millimeter, they know, but the actual units calibration is different. That's why you have to teach it what the correct calibration is based upon your machine. So if something drastically changes, like you change a motor or you disconnect, I mean, something changed, or your chain changes a different area, that's why they're always saying you have to recalibrate and you have to remeasure, because you're having to reteach all of the motors exactly what the distance is from point A to point B. And then at that point it knows, then it becomes intelligent, so to speak, and knows, okay, so this is how far it is to be able to move 1 millimeter. I might have to do this little bit of an offset, if that makes sense.
I see. Yeah. So, I mean, is there a recommendation in terms of how often I should do like a recalibration if I if things get off kilter, like do it every other day or what?
Not on the M2, no. The Maslow you need to recalibrate and calibrate it and get it set up every time you cut. You have to go through the calibration process. So it would, because it didn't, the Maker board that it used didn't remember and store all those values. This board does. So as long as it maintains power, it has everything. If it loses power completely, it still has a chip in there that will remember everything. But if it ever gets kind of weird, and the way that is like when you say, go home, then the main value that it gets lost is where it is in relation to the frame. So like when you say home, it's going to 0, 0, but that might not actually be like 0, 0 where it needs to be. So that's where that reset chains button comes in. So did you mark like on your chains? So like, okay, great.
Absolutely.
So that's what that reset chains button does. That's kind of like a recalibration of just like, hey, we're going to set this over again. So, you kind of set a dummy, like home, and then move your sled around until those motors are at 12 o'clock and your chains are marked on there. And then say reset chains. And then when you say reset chains, then it knows, okay, this is where I am. I'm going to use all these settings and I'm good to go. It helps sometimes calibrating for different materials too, especially if you're going to do like way different depths. Because it's going to be in a little bit different spot, you can recalibrate it for, you know, that size material. And by doing that, you can do the edge calibration, and then that can kind of tell it where it is. So you can change your material, then do a different edge calibration. So I know some people do that. I usually don't unless I'm going to cut something really small. I usually leave mine at the 4/8 calibration.
Okay.
And it's kind of varied, like inside of MakerMade and in the community, of how often people recalibrate for different materials and things like that. But for the most part, you don't have to unless you're going to make like a drastic change.
I see.
One of the things that you can do, I would say, like number one is just hitting that reset change and making sure it changes the next place. And then the
Okay.
next one is for your material is moving your ring right here, your ring mount. You can move this up and down because you want to make sure that this is parallel with where the chain is coming off of the motor sprockets. So does that make sense?
No,
So,
let's just again.
So if it's like this, and then the motors are like maybe over here a little bit, and the chain's going off in that direction, it's going to change how the sled moves. So that can cause some problems too. So making sure that you move this ring up or down a little bit to make sure that like the chain, like in this case, maybe we'd move it up so then it would be lined up, going straight up to coming off of the motor sprockets. So that's what you can do to make sure that it's like lined up with it. And that can help with more calibrated cuts as well. There's a lot of things that go into it on the way that it's moving around and moving around in space. But the most common is making sure that your chains are reset, that ring bearing carriage is moved up or down if it needs to, the roll bearing carriage, and then the edge calibration as well, and making sure that that's set. So those are the kind of the three big things. And really, if it starts doing, if it just starts being really weird and starts like slanting really bad or doing something that it shouldn't be doing, then if you want to, you can wipe all your calibration settings and go again. But it's usually not needed to do that.
Yeah. That was it. Yeah, that was a difficult time for me initially.
It takes a while to get going. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. The one thing I did have another question. Sometimes when I'm moving the Z-axis, and so maybe this just comes into, I'm covering the camera. Yeah, maybe it just comes into the whole doing the scaling, the Z scaling. But sometimes I see the belt moving, but the axis itself, it's not moving. The things that moving. So when it's initially calibrated, should the sled be all the way down? I'm covering things. Should it be all the way down, or should it be all the way back, or what's the best way to get that straight?
You mean, so let me make sure that I understand here. So like, is this spinning, but then it's not moving up and down?
Sometimes, yes, I've noticed that.
So make sure these are tight. So make sure that both of these gears here, this large gear, small gear, make sure that these little set screws here are tight and they're connected. Because if one of them's loose, it will spin in place. So more like if you see the belt moving, then and this isn't moving, then this one is probably loose. So you can tighten these set screws and make sure that belt is parallel as well between these two gears, and tighten that to make sure that that's set. And that
I'll verify.
Like moving up and down. Yeah, John, what's up? You can speak up. What's up?
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, and to be able to help out with the question, that might actually directly translate to some of your scaling issues, because the motor is possibly moving, that gear could be slipping. And so, yeah, like Drew's saying, tighten it up, but also not the red one, blue. Go blue Loctite, because the blue Loctite can actually end up being brought back out. The red stuff is more of the permanent stuff, but a little bit of the blue Loctite, just a little dab on some of those little grub screws can kind of hold it in. I mean, not like a whole awful lot, but just something so that, because it's a machine, as there's vibration, as there's movement, it can have a tendency to want to kind of bring them back out again. So put it in there, clamp it down, But if you notice that's the problem, like you said, then you're going to want to go back in and do your test again to be able to see for your scaling and your offset on your Z. And even that could just simply be some of your issue. You know, if you're
Yeah,
having what looks like slippage and it's not moving, then it can be accumulative. You know, by the time you get to a specific cut, it slowly it keeps bringing something down and down. And then by the time it's catching and it's about ready to go all the way down, you know, it's plunging deeper than what it's supposed to.
yeah,
Yeah, or it's
yeah.
like just tight enough to move up and down, but then when it meets resistance of your material, it's starting
Right.
to spin. So yeah,
Yep.
I would check that tighten first. And Loctite that's a great tip too, because over time parts will just wiggle loose, because I mean that router is just spinning and the RPMs are going nuts. So the whole thing is vibrating and shaking, and that over time is going to shake all the little bolts and screws loose.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Makes
so there's
sense. Yeah.
Loctite on the main parts, but the grub screws, because yeah, you put them in there, they don't have Loctite.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. As you were talking, I guess it kind of made sense that, you know, that might be, you know, what's going on. But the sled itself, I'm not sure the you know the correct term, but you know, where you're just looking, not the blue sled, but actually the portion that the router sits on to go up and down on the Z-axis. Yeah, that, but the part that advances as the motor turns, yes, that. When it's
You can't really see it, but there's the router clamp here. Yeah, this part.
yeah, that's right. So as the clamp goes up and down, should it be? I'm sorry. You know, as the when it's calibrated, should it be all the way, you know, toward the blue sled, or should it be at its furthest point away from the blue sled, you know, when you're getting it set up to be calibrated?
So that's where your 0 is. So that's where you set 0 on it. So
Okay.
I recommend putting your router in the clamp pretty close to where the bit is, because that's where that spinning motor is, and you want the clamp to really hold on to where that motor is. So
Okay.
like if you hold on to the top part, let's say like, you know, this is the router, it's going to wobble some. But if you put it down here, right where that RPM is, and that's going to help it keep it secure as it spins round and round and round. So having it a little higher up and mounted on there can be useful. I can kind of show you on mine right here. So I don't know if my camera's long enough, but you can kind of see, let's see. You can kind of see how mine's a little bit higher up, and it's mounted close to the bottom here.
Yeah.
There.
I
so
see.
it's kind of mounted to where it's holding it where the RPMs are spinning there on the bottom. And then as far as where it's going to be on the sled, it doesn't really matter. You're going to set that in your settings for 0. So when you set 0 on there, you're going to tell it, like, you know, you're going to put the bit inside of your router, and then put your router in the clamp, and then you're going to move it and tell it where 0 is. And then when you set it that 0, it's going to know, okay, this is my work surface. And then you can set offsets on that, you know, if you put different bits in and things like that. But you're going to tell it where the work surface is. So when you tell it 0, that's where 0 is going to be.
That's where it is all the time. Yeah.
So it's going to be different based on what kind of bit you have in there, what your router is, and those different kinds of things too. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily matter on the initial setup, because every time, you know, you're going to do it, it's going to change.
It's going to be a little,
so that makes sense.
Exactly.
I would say that the only time that it would end up making a difference when you do the settings is if you plan on cutting something deep instead of it being shallow. Because if you are cutting something that's deep and you're expecting the unit to be able to, the actual carriage that's there for the router to be able to ride in, and you've set it in such a way that possibly the clamp in that carriage is down towards the bottom, and you've clamped a hold of it, and you've set your references and you've set your 0, and then the machine decides that it wants to plunge in for a cut, and you didn't give it enough travel to be able to do that. That's when you have to have the thought process. But I mean, most people are usually not cutting anything, you know, greater than, you know, like a sheet of plywood, or possibly doing the engraving. But if you ever did cut something that was deeper and you wanted to do that, you just got to make sure that there's enough in relationship to your bit and where your router is that's there, that the actual access has enough travel. And sometimes you'll see that in reverse, where some guys will be, because Easel or Fusion 360 or any of them that are out there will sit there, and as it's moving from one position to the other, it'll want to bring the bit up and move over and then move back down. But there's times in which some guys haven't planned that in, and the unit decides to move itself all the way up, and it's hitting against the top of that Z axis. Because remember, to an extent,
and then it hit the soft limit, and then then it stops your cut.
Yeah,
That's right.
Exactly. So I mean, it's one of those where it's easy to think that it's really smart, but it isn't. It relies a lot. It relies a lot on us to be able to make sure and to tell it its limits and its boundaries, and then it can do a lot of cool stuff and some smart stuff that are pretty amazing.
So it can move 4 inches up and down about. But you can get a little bit more depth, like if you set your router in a different spot, because then it could go 4 inches, and then as tall as your router is, if you put it up toward the top, it might wobble a little bit, and the cuts that are down deep might not look as good, but you can kind of, it's kind of a patchwork way to get it to cut a little bit deeper than 100 mil.
I got you. Yeah, so it might be, like initially that, you might set it up so that the carriage, that was a word I couldn't think of, so that the carriage might be in the middle, between, the upper and lower limits. But, if you want to do like a deep cut, you might consider bringing the carriage, closer to the upper limit, or, the outer limit, outer limits.
Changing where your router is. Yeah.
Exactly, so that you might be able to get a deeper cut, or vice versa. I dig it. Okay.
Yeah, so if you've got more like thicker than 2x4s and things like that, that's when you'd want to work with that and be kind of like playing around. But with this one, like you can cut deep enough to go through a 2x4 if you're
Yeah, I'm not doing that. But yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I appreciate your help very much, and John, and thank you as well. Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Do you have any more questions? John, you got any questions?
Well, I might be able to pick your brain, but I just wanted to make sure that Ruben was able to get all of his questions possibly answered. So yeah.
Well, again, I appreciate you guys' help. You all have a great holiday, and let me get back at this.
Yeah. So and just a word too. So we're gonna take our support team. All of us are taking off tomorrow through Sunday. So you won't get a message through then if you message us. And then next week's CNC call too, we're also taking off. All intermittent vacations and stuff. So we'll be available in email support, but not for the CNC call next week. So just so you know.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was glad I was able to get hold of you. I couldn't find the number, the meeting ID initially, so I sent I put in a ticket. So, but I'm glad I was able to touch base with it. See, I don't know. I probably wasn't thinking. I just went to like the main page, but afterward I went back to the website, and then I just went into the resources, and then eventually found it. But when I first put in, I was just doing a search. I was like, MakerMade M2 weekly call. That's what I put in, like in
Google or Google. On our website.
I put it in Google, but actually I put in the weekly call on the website. I did also put it on the website, and I couldn't find it. So, but it's the upside is since you now have connected, it should end up being in the history now on your Zoom. Yeah. So on your Zoom, the meeting ID should end up being in there with the tagline. However, MakerMade has ended up doing the tagline. So you should end up seeing the actual meeting itself, and then the password's fairly easy. Just make it with a space in between, all lowercase. So that's a nice thing. It's just the first time you connect, and then it ends up being easy. Zoom ends up remembering those as long as you connect on the same device, or you have your profile set up on it.
Thanks for
I don't do a lot of Zoom, so but I appreciate that you have this. Very much.
And the reason that I asked is I want it to be really intuitive for people to find it. So if you
Yeah.
searched on the website, I'm going to go and make sure that those pages are tagged with like CNC call and stuff like that, because the crawler
Yeah.
just might not have picked up the little widget that has the information in it. So I'm going to go and make sure that's on the page. So like if you go and search for it, then it pops up right away so you can find it. So I appreciate
Sure.
it.
Yeah. No, yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I'm looking at the verbiage here. It's weekly live maker Q&A session, but I was just thinking Zoom calls. So when I put
Zoom
in
call is what I need to put in there. Yeah. So
yeah.
I'll check that and make sure that it gets in there. Sweet.
All right, cool. Well, glad to help.
Yeah, you bet. Appreciate it.
So
Let us know if you need it.
y'all, yeah, for sure. Y'all have a great holiday, and again, I thank you for your help.
You bet. See you, Ruben.
All right, now take care.
See you, Ruben.
Thanks, Jen. Bye-bye.
Hey, Drew.
Hey, how's it going?
Not too bad. Nice to be able to meet you in person. So I've
Yeah.
been
Uh-oh. You muted. You muted. Can you hear me?
there you go. Sorry. Push the setting and it ended up changing stuff. Anyways, no, I've been picking Joel's brain off and on. So now I get to possibly pick your brain.
He knows more than me. Just letting you know. Joel is the expert among experts, man.
So I'm in the process, and I've been picking a bunch of other people's brain too. Me and Casey are on like a one-on-one FaceTime conversation back and forth to each other. So I'm actually picking the ball up from a project that he started and then just decided to not work on anymore. So I'm looking to be able to tackle the gantry system that he was attempting to be able to do for the actual M2. So the X in the Y gantry system that he was working on, he started working on it like middle of the pandemic.
Okay.
And so the idea is that to start off, even though I'm currently not a machinist, I used to be. So by means of trade school and my college training, I am a machinist / millwright. But I don't do that anymore. I actually I install high-end kitchens. So finished carpentry, kitchen cabinetry, crown molding. And so doing this is kind of nice, brings back memories from over 20 years ago. So
flashbacks, hopefully good ones.
Yeah, no, good ones. These are definitely smaller machines than I'm used to working for. I mean, I was working on machines, where you could machine a part, like the size of a car. So I mean, big machines. But anyways, the idea that he had, and also once I had gotten my M2, the gear started thinking about this before, is that you have a surface, you have the idea that your sled and the Z-axis, everything is solely related to it riding against the material. And like you were saying, your material can bow, it can sit there, it can move. And then also it is dependent on whether or not, humidity and moisture when it comes to the actual entire mounting of the entire unit itself, because it is, even though it has metal components, it's still primarily assembled by wood. And most people are putting it in their garage, which isn't usually climate controlled to begin with. And depending on your region of the area, there's a lot of things that can maneuver and change. So my thought process, in something that he had experimented with, but he was using slightly different parts, but I'm starting to use some other parts, is having the still all chain driven with the chains, but having a free flowing X and Y axis that the sled is mounted in, and then it suddenly becomes more like a true, so it suddenly becomes more like a true CNC,
traditional CNC machine. Yeah, where it's
exactly.
The change of still the drive motors, but instead of moving like a belt, it's being pulled by the chains, but then kind of it's being guided around, I guess, by the
So he had been helping me out with, I was getting a bunch of spare parts, so I ended up And thankfully Joe was able to find some, but when I put in my request, it was funny. I was like, yes, can you possibly get me, how many did I end up getting? I think it was like 16 or 18. I was like, can I get maybe like 16 or 18 of your V groove bearings off of you? And he's like, you need how many? I mean, it's a funny, this email, because it's not actually phone conversation, it's email. And he's like, how many do you need? And I was like, yeah, I'm just trying to see if you have it. I was like, I know you offer it, it's there. I said, but I don't want to clear you guys out. I don't want to sit there and end up making it problematic. I said, we're still in the midst of a pandemic, especially even with supply chain issues. So I don't want to clear you completely out. And then he's like, so do you want the shoulder bolts with those too? And I was like, that would be great if you got them. But again, I don't want to clear you out. And then I was asking for some other different miscellaneous parts. But my idea is to have that. And I found a sourcing for some inexpensive 80-20 compatible aluminum extrusion, and also Casey had tried doing a linear rail system for his, but he noticed an issue. So linear rails, he was running it off of rods with the bearings. The only problem is that the sled itself has weight, and when you're sitting there and you're milling it against a surface, it's going to sit there and want to end up skewing and torquing it. And he was mentioning before, I mean, we're talking, he's like, I know the solution would be to go up to a chrome moly one. He said, but that would end up being atrociously expensive. So he just kind of ditched the program and went off tackling some other stuff. But for me, the top and bottom running off of a solid rail, and the rail idea is just really simplistic. It is standoffs, metal bar, 4 V grooves on either side, 4 V grooves on either side, riding on that rail.
Yeah. Like a hot end of a 3D printer.
Yeah, pretty much. But then have that at the top and the bottom, so that's free moving, ends up going that way. But then to translate the up and down and not have the deflection that way, but also not occupy so much space, because you don't want to keep, because doing it that way, you're adding height. And then again, you don't want to keep sitting there and bringing the sled farther and farther and farther away, or having to come out with some ideas. I wanted to try to keep it more of a slim profile. For the next access, I'm doing a linear rail, but a T linear rail. So it ends up being where it is the solid steel bar that is mounted to an aluminum A-frame. So they're mini, but then they're by C's, so it rides. So it'll sit there and ride up on both of them. So you have, and so far, you have almost like zero deflection that you end up having with it. And there's a couple of guys where I saw that have attempted to do it, but some of them I've noticed that they don't allow themselves for the machine to be able to, the sled to be able to go all the way up past your work material and all the way down. And they don't allow it to be able to go far enough distance left and right, because you want the unit to be able to move out of the way so you could actually put a piece of material on it.
Right. Yeah.
And in picking with Joel's brain,
right.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's like a gantry system on top of your material, on top of your frame.
Yeah,
right?
Well, so it's mounted against the frame, and so the material would end up being, so your spoiler board would be like a true spoiler board on an actual CNC, except just in vertical. And so that opens up a whole lot of options, because that then allows you could actually finish your spoiler board. So you could actually take a surfacing bit, and you could actually surface your spoiler board flat, which is what they do commonly in the industry. That is what they end up doing. Then some of the other options, because I had mentioned them before, and this is what he was going to check with whoever deals with your guys' for the software programming for the Makerverse end of it. He said he was going to talk with them next week. So the M2 normally the way it stands, the hard limit function that is in Makerverse that is normally deactivated doesn't make much sense, because how do you put a harm limit, on something that is, running on chains, free floating over a piece of material? That's why the soft limits are always more reasonable. But the hard limits in the actual true CNC world really makes life great in that you can't, even if something ends up hiccuping, the unit still will stop before it'll sit there and tear itself apart. Because commonly, I mean, not commonly, but you can see it sometimes on the user group where ones will be in where people are like tearing apart their rings because they might have walked away and it decides to do something, and they don't realize that those stepper motors have strength to them. They have,
they're powerful worm gears. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that gear ratio will sit there and rip stuff apart. But like I told him, I said, I'm not quite sure though, when you guys ended up, and this is one of the questions he's going to ask for the software guy, is on your Arduino, when you end up having the top board that was added to it and they took the pins up,
yeah,
and then end up having all of your access, whether or not, because the Arduino board I know supports hard limits, and I know Makerverse supports hard limits, but I don't know when the extra board was stacked on top, whether or not the pin outs were actually occupied by other things, such as when the laser or when other things were done, or the power indicator light. I mean, where different things were configured with the next board up, whether or not any of those were occupied. Because if it wasn't, I told him, I said, it would be great to experiment with it. So he says he was going to find out for me.
So I know a little bit about that. I don't know for sure if they're occupied or not. I do know that, like what I was talking about with Ruben, that there's some different firmware upgrades and things like that that you can do to the firmware that actually runs it. So I don't know if you're on our Git to see our GitHub, where you can go and see it. All the source code and everything is all open.
Yeah, I've been there, and I've been kind of doing a dive. That's why I got in and I was able to see, oh, okay, yeah, the hard, it's an option. I mean, it's there. The guts are there.
But I want to say, like, I'm not sure, but I want to say that the pinouts are not occupied, because I know that there was a development meeting that we had. It was a long time ago, but we were talking about the like the possibility of adding limit switches someday, and then that was a possible thing that we could do to activate inside the firmware, and it would support it on the do board. So I don't think there's a hardware change for that, just based on that conversation that we were having. But I'm not a programmer, so Larry did. So I'm not 100% on that, if those pinouts are occupied. I want to say that probably not, but I don't know enough about programming or where it would be. But you can go and you can download the code and you can modify it and flash a new version of the firmware to try to activate it and play around with it.
Right.
For sure, if you want.
Yeah. So he was going to check it. He was going to check it out for me and see whether or not it's something that. Whether or not it was actually that was there. So it was just.
I know it's possible, but I'm not sure the steps that it would take to do it.
Yeah, because I'm used.
At the least, it would take a firmware change at the least.
So the interesting thing is, I mean, the current setup on the M2 is the only reasonable spot that you could end up having a hard limit is just on the Z axis right now. I mean, the way it stands. But that being the case, you sit there and you go through their user groups. Everybody's having an issue just trying to keep their Z-axis cable in sometimes, that it's adding, a couple of extra wires in there to be able to go for a hard limit is another troubleshooting scenario. But if you end up changing the situation where the entire thing ends up being more, compatible, that ends up having the hard limits, it may or may not be a nice. But I was telling them before that the idea of having the gantry system over your X and your Y, then it becomes usable to start machining various different pieces of material and not being constrained by, you don't have to set up, extra support. I mean, your sled, you don't have to worry about it falling off. You don't have to worry about it. It stays just consistently, it stays consistently in the plane, that's been defined.
So when I'm trying to remember that discussion that we had about the limit switches, because it was about the Z-axis, and it ended up being, it was like a hardware change, because we have to change the hardware itself and add limit switches and wire them, and then it would be a firmware update. And then the third thing was that if someone's G code, like, because we don't have the G code integrated into Makerverse, you could still set a G code that would go over that hard limit. So like, send a command to say like move 200 millimeters on the Z, even if there's a limit switch on it, it's going to follow that 200 command, and it's going to go because then it's going to like wait for that command. So it would need to be in your like actual G code creation, where an error would pop up to say, hey, this exceeds the hard limits. And it would need to pop up in the G code to make sure that someone didn't accidentally move that around, because you can't send a G code command in the current setup of the M2 to say, hey, move over here. And then if it runs into something, it won't stop. The only way to make it stop is to like literally like take power away from it, because even the stop command just enters another G code command. So you literally have to remove.
For in the short term, that's what I was telling him. I was like, well, I said in the short term, even if there isn't a practical workaround that's with it, I mean, still in the setup that I'm doing, wiring the limits to a relay to be able to just sit there and end up kicking the power supply that ends up running to the actual Arduino. I mean, it still ends up sustaining life enough that, it'll still end up bringing power from the USB supply, but it'll sit there and stop the power to the actual stepper motors, to stop it where it's at. But I think, because I overheard you talking with Ruben there, that I think it's nice to be able to hear that the next possible progression would end up being having the G code be more edited within the actual source, even if somebody decided to use another program, because I know from the industry before of being in for CNC, the programs that we were running were not programmed manually, on the machines. They were programmed by CAD CAM operators, in an office somewhere, going through, laying everything out. But the nice thing is that we had the ability in real time that we could sit there and be like, okay, we ran something through, you know what? I don't like that offset. I have my tool that's in here. I'm going to step up my offset, or I'm going to bring it down a little bit in real time. And so the actual program integration that was there was manipulating the G code in real time. You could just simply pause the program, didn't even have to start it from the beginning, change, switch it out, run. And even and I followed you with being able to sit there and enter with the G code. And yeah, there are lines of code at the beginning that sit there and end up saying, here's home. The start of this program, we want you to start all the way down in this specific corner at this specific height, going at this specific feed rate, and it applies to everything else. If you eliminate that, then it just sits there and it doesn't know what to do. But I think if some of those things end up getting integrated, that'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the, like, those industrial CNC machines, that's kind of what that sets us apart from a lot of the more like hobbyist, home use, home business type of CNC machines, because they have all those other extra features. You pay premium for that. So because it's a difficult for you to like go in there and code it and change it. But that's definitely things that we've talked about with our developers to try to have that ability to go in and edit G code, because it would be great to be like, to go in there and change it right away, to cut this line of code out or move this part over here, or for someone that knew what they were doing to go and manipulate that, or be like, actually I want my cut depth to be a little bit more, I don't like this, or it needs to be a little bit less, and then you could like change that, and it would instantly change every one of your depths and every line of code. Like that's the type of thing that we would like to see someday, but it's a bear to program and to work on.
I can imagine. I sat there and I was reading through one of the posts. Somebody was sitting there and was asking, it was like, so how did they say it? does Makerverse support canned cycles? And I'm like, it'll run canned cycles. I said, but it doesn't support it. And what it was is this person, I started talking with them, and they were a machinist, and they're used to on a machine that you sit there and it, you know, there would be a specific code. Okay, I want to run a drill peck cycle. I want to sit there and end up drilling, and it automatically, you know, you would sit in there and you program in your values. Okay, I wanted to do this big of a feed rate. Here's my drill bit, boom. And I'm like, yeah, Makerverse doesn't allow you to do that. I said, but you need to go into another program, whatever you're using, you know, Fusion 360, Easel, one of these. I said, and you need to tell it, I need to drill a hole here. It'll program it, and it, you know, it'll sit there and add lines and lines and lines of code to be able to do exactly what you're telling it to do. I said, but there is no real time. I said, you have to realize, I said, that's pretty complicated what you're asking for it to do. Yeah. It's not, I said, it's not a dedicated computer machine that all it does is CNC, you know, sitting inside, you know, a control panel. This is a software program that you're asking to do a pretty complex act. And so in the end, he seemed to understand it, but.
Yeah, it's a lot, because it's either, programming it in your G code or like manually doing it where you're moving it up and down with Makerverse, but that's going to take forever. And that's what robots were existed to help us not have to do. So like,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, nice. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, buddy. I gotta run to my next customer, but
Good
look
luck.
forward to.
Yeah, I got one last question for you. Do you use the M2 for your scroll work on your cabinetry and stuff like that?
So I actually don't make my own cabinetry. I'm installing cabinetry for other places, but my idea for my M2s is I use it for jigs, for being able to make different jigs, fixtures that I end up needing. I mean, I am in the process. I'm in my work van right now, but I am in the process of redoing my shelving units that are back in the back of this. So designing it, and it just makes sense. Plus, I mean, I have these boards that I use. It's called an MFT table. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's like it's 3 feet by 5 feet. It's a board, and it has a series of holes, just constantly, consistently drilled. But then there's handles, there's holes in it, and
so you can make sure that you can put jigs and stuff on it to make sure you're always doing the exact same thing.
Yeah. So what we use that in cabinet industry is we'll sit there and we'll lay them down on a pair of horses, or we'll lay them on like one of the Bora stands that you end up having. You sit there, you lay it down, you secure it, and then you have dog holes everywhere, you know, that you can just secure your work surface. Everything's true, but they're light. Slide them in your van. Those puppies, if you buy them from places, I mean, so there are companies that legitimately make them, they're expensive. But even to have a legitimate full fab shop make them, so besides paying for your piece of ply, you're looking at anywhere from about 75 to 100 bucks. Yeah. So in some of those, we use as a surface, a sacrificial surface for our track saws. So we're sitting there and running. So with time, it gets all scarred up. You throw it away, you know, cut it up, burn your burn pile, however you want to do it. But then you got to make another one. So you're like, okay, I just got to spend, you know, another $100 plus the plywood to be able to get a company to make it. I'm like, nope, make it myself.
Yeah, nice.
just run it through, because I acquired the CAD file for it. And so that's why it's just easier. I'm like, okay, well, I mean, I have the CAD file, you know, and right now I'm currently using Easel, but I'm thinking I might actually switch over to Fusion 360. I'm thinking about it, because I think it might allow me to be able to do some of the more precise cuts. More precise cuts, but then also getting some of the detailed aspect that Easel doesn't. And plus, I mean, they're sitting there, they're about ready now to, I think next year, I think my price is locked in for a while, but I think next year they're upping the price on it. So
well, cool. Well, good luck cutting your tables, and let us know how that jig goes, and looking forward to seeing your M2 creation.
Yeah, I'll definitely. Yeah, I got still a lot of work that ends up needing to go into it yet, but
Absolutely.
looking forward to, and also picking Joel's brain a little bit more. But I appreciate you allowing me to sit in, Drew.
Yeah, you bet, John. All right, well, take it easy and have a good holiday.
Thank you. You too.
See ya.
Yep. Bye.